Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Stempian, Education and Community Programs Manager at the Holland Museum. Thank you for joining us virtually this evening for the final program in support of our current exhibition, In Service to Others, A History of Holland's Women Missionaries. This program is being recorded. Please remain on mute throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, you may enter them in the chat, and we will share them during the Q&A following the presentation. Links to the program recording and a program survey will be emailed tomorrow to our program participants. And we appreciate you sharing your thoughts about this and future programs. Before we get started, I have some announcements to share. And although we are not physically together this evening, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the space that the Holland Museum and the Capon and Settlers House Museums occupy. The Holland area surrounds Lake Makatawa, ancestrally known to the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Peoria nations as Mekatugami, or Black Lake. Each nation has their own rich cultural traditions and beliefs that still survive today. We, the Holland Museum, acknowledge that this land is sacred, and we commit to honoring the land and the indigenous peoples who have stewarded it for generations through continuing education, partnerships, and self-reflection. Thank you. Our current exhibition, In Service to Others, A History of Holland's Women Missionaries, explores the varied roles of local women in the missionary field who sought to improve lives through expansion of education and healthcare to communities across the globe. This exhibition will be open until November 28th, and the museum's hours are Mondays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 10 until 5. We are always open on the second Monday of the month in the evening from 4 to 7 for free. So we hope to see you at the museum soon. We have some really great programs coming up in the next couple of weeks. Join Deb Wake from the Holland Museum for a slightly spooky, completely historical, and totally family-friendly walking tour through Pilgrim Home Cemetery. Dress for the weather and to walk for about an hour. People who have registered for this can meet Deb in the parking lot of the Ray and Sue Smith Stadium next to Pilgrim Home Cemetery. The tour dates are Saturday, October 8th and the 15th at 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Tours are $5 plus a small processing fee, and pre-registration is required. And you can register at our website, hollandmuseum.org. Also, on October 20th at 7 p.m., join Chris C.J. Kingdom Greer, current Yates Township Idlewild historian and archivist, for his talk, Idlewild, the Black Eden of Michigan, Heirlooms of the Past Honored in the Present. This free program will be in person at the Holland Museum. And this program is for free. And for more information on this program and other upcoming programs, or to register to attend, check out our website, hollandmuseum.org. And so we can keep these and other programs free or at a low cost to be as accessible as possible for the community. We would appreciate any donations at the link that's included below, and will also be in the chat. So on to tonight's program. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Hope College Associate Professor of History, Gloria Tseng. Professor Tseng teaches courses on modern Chinese and modern European history. Her current research examines the indigenization of Protestant Christianity in 20th century China, the historical processes by which Christianity evolved from a foreign faith associated with Western imperialism to a faith embraced by as many as 10% of the population. Tonight, she'll be exploring how Christian missionary endeavors in China in the early 20th century impacted Chinese literature created during that time. Please welcome Professor Gloria Tseng. So I will turn off my screen and, oops, sorry, wrong one. I will stop sharing and turn things over to Professor Tseng. There she is.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for sharing a Thursday evening with me here. Thank you, Michelle, for inviting me to take part in, to support this exhibition, which is of great interest to me. As you mentioned, that my research is on the indigenization of Protestant Christianity in China. This evening, I just practiced sharing my screen, so let me all right, so this evening, I will be speaking about speaking on a man named Ba Jin, who was an early 20th century Chinese writer who was instrumental and one of the important writers in creating modern Chinese literature. I was pleasantly surprised to discover that actually even the Japanese who are interested in Asian literature and civil and culture in general, they started a Fukuoka prizes, and in 1990, I believe it was an inaugural year of the prizes. Ba Jin won the special commemorative prize. And in the citation for the prize, it is stated that he is one of the greatest writers of modern and contemporary Chinese literature. That his major works are based on have a great concern for humanity. And Ba Jin in modern Chinese history suffered severely during the Cultural Revolution, but he was reinstated after the Cultural Revolution and went on to live a long and fruitful life, and only died, I think, at 103 years old. So this was a man who, well, 100, maybe 100, the number 101. So he was born in 1904 at the beginning of the 20th century and died at the beginning of the 21st century. He was a son of a gentry family in Sichuan province, a family with a long tradition, a long literary tradition that produced several scholar officials in the waning years of the Qing dynasty. He rejected his gentry upbringing, plunged headlong into the May 4th movement and its critique of traditional Chinese literature. Embraced anarchism as his lifelong faith. My talk is based on two of his early works. The first one is called Perdition, which was published in 1929, and the second work called New Birth, titled New Birth, published in 1932. And this is a cover from a 1989 publication of Renmin Literary Publishing House. And at this point, I would like to say a brief word about the May 4th movement. The May 4th movement, to which I will refer to repeatedly in this talk, had a political dimension. It was at once a nationalistic awakening. On May 4th, 1919, around 3,000 students from 13 universities in Beijing gathered in protest against the Versailles Treaty, which allowed Japan to keep the Chinese territory it had seized from Germany at the outbreak of the First World War. But the May 4th movement also had an important cultural dimension. It encompassed broad critiques of traditional Chinese culture. It included a lot of experimentation with the Chinese language, and it is credited with the birth of modern Chinese literature. And Ba Jin is interesting to me in this project because his life occurred at the intersection of important turning points in modern Chinese history. He lived during the so-called golden age of missionary movement to China, which was followed by a wave of anti-Christian movement. And his life, as I mentioned, coincided with the cultural effervescence, actually contributed to the cultural effervescence of the May 4th movement and the unrest of the warlord period, the nationalist regime, and the rise of the Chinese Communist movement, all in the 1920s. Previously, I had assumed that Ba Jin was a secular writer, and which he was, among many of whom the Christian message failed to win, and he was among those who advocated that revolution was the means to preserve China as a nation and civilization. But I came upon a book by the author Yang Jianlong titled The Influence of Christian Culture on the New Literature of May 4th. And I will come back to the argument of this book in a bit more detail. But suffice to say at this point that this book got me rethinking about the secular writers on one camp and Christian writers on the other camp. I had, up to this time, I had been studying Chinese Christian publications in the 20th century, in the 1900s, the Republican era. But this is a venture into the broader modern literature or broader new literature that was being created during the same time, during the same period. Now, the first quarter of the 20th century was described by Daniel Bayes in A New History of Christianity in China as the golden age of the Sino-foreign Protestant establishment. How so? The numbers give us a sense. Protestant missionaries established many institutions in China, and they really came to fruition or reached a height in the first quarter of the 20th century. At the end of the 19th century, there were only about 17,000 students in mission schools. By the second decade of the 20th century, that number had increased tenfold to 170,000. By the mid-1920s, 250,000 students were in mission schools. And this was, of course, had missionary involvement to make this possible. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there were about 3,500 foreign missionaries. By 1915, 5,500, and by 1920s, the number of missionaries reached its height to more than 8,000. Now, in 1900, there were about 100,000 Chinese Protestants. A decade and a half later, that number more than doubled, almost tripled. And then in the 20s, there were 500,000 communicants. So this was a period of great missionary involvement. Now, in addition to numbers, if we were to hear the description of Kenneth Latourette, who served as professor of missions and Oriental history at Yale University, he observed in 1926, quote, "To the visitor to China in the year 1926, one of the most interesting and thought-provoking features of the landscape was the physical evidence of the activities of Christian missionaries. If the traveler entered the country by Shanghai, on the outskirts of the city, his steamer passed the substantial buildings of an institution which he was informed was Shanghai College, maintained by American Baptists. Once in the city, if he were observant, he found buildings of the young men's and young women's Christian associations, churches, Christian hospitals, and schools, and a structure called the Missions Building, in which was the headquarters of many national and local Protestant organizations. If the tourist pursued his way through the provinces, he saw in provincial capitals the physical proofs that the missionary had been there before him. In Changsha, the capital of Hunan, for example, there were much evidence of churches, schools, and the buildings of the Young Men's Christian Association. The traveler also discovered sometimes in the most remote districts, churches, chapels, preaching halls, schools, orphanages, hospitals, dispensaries, and in them he met Europeans, Americans, and Chinese serving as pastors, catechists, teachers, or physicians. Now, the era in which Ba Jin lived was characterized by more than extensive missionary activity and highly visible Western presence. It was also characterized by appalling social misery, increasing anti-Western and anti-imperialist sentiment, and the rivalry between the two political parties that would determine the fate of modern China. After the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, by the Republican Revolution of 1911, China soon fell into a state of fragmentation. Various military strongmen or warlords became de facto rulers of regions of various sizes. The Nationalist Party, the successor to the 1911 Republican Revolution, and the newly founded Chinese Communist Party entered into an alliance in 1923. An important plank in both parties' agenda was the struggle against Western imperialism in China, which they believed was the cause of the myriad unjust conditions that were imposed on China since the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century. The two parties launched a military campaign in 1926, the Northern Expedition, to defeat the warlords and unify China. The military campaign was accompanied by much anti-imperialist agitation and even violence against Westerners. Missionaries were among those targeted, which dealt a severe blow to the missionary presence in China. As Daniel Bayes observes, during the Northern Expedition, quote, when the parties sent their military forces northward from Canton in the summer of 1926, Christian venues, including churches and landmarks, were harassed and disrupted or damaged, and some casualties were suffered. After J.E. Williams, the vice president of Nanking University, was shot and killed on campus by revolutionary troops in early 1927, and several other foreigners were killed, the foreign consuls ordered evacuation by their citizens. All but a handful of foreign missionaries fled to the coast, mainly to Shanghai. Over 2,000 returned home, some taking early furlough, some decided never to return. Of those who returned to their posts, they did so only in late 1927 or 1928. Most missionaries who had fled in 1926 to 1907 returned in 28 and 29, but they still fell short of the height of 8,000 men and women at the height of the missionary movement. About 6,000 out of the 8,000 remained. Now, Shanghai, so this was the context in which Ba Jin embarked on his literary career. Shanghai was China's most modern city and literary hub, yet a city of jarring contrasts. Literature meant more than a profession to Ba Jin. It was a life calling which in turn was inextricably connected with the fate of China as a nation state, a new nation state fighting for its survival. Shanghai, China's most modern city at the time, epitomized Western imperialism, the Christian missionary presence and opulence juxtaposed with appalling misery. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So we'll just take a quick look through some of the historical pictures of Shanghai from the early 20th century. In Shanghai, we could see European-styled mansions with lovely, peaceful gardens. And on the outskirts, we could see houses built, huts, not houses, huts built with reeds. In Shanghai, there were luxury hotels like the Astor House on Suzhou Creek, and there were factories that fueled the industrialization of China. Here is a foundry workshop from 1900 and a timber workshop from 1900. At the same time, European warships can be seen on the Huangpu River, which ran along Shanghai. Shanghai was also where the new government focused the new government of the nationalist government that was established in 1928 as a result of the Northern Expedition, focused all its modernization efforts. GMC trucks were bought and delivered to the GMD government, to this location next to the YMCA in Shanghai. But Shanghai was also a place where public beheadings still took place. Therefore, Ba Jin's use of biblical imagery and terminology is ironic, for he was a lifelong advocate of anarchism, and romantic young men and women who ally themselves with the masses and devote themselves to the revolutionary cause are the heroes and heroines of his works. I want to argue that a nuanced reading of these two influences in Ba Jin's works, of which Perdition and New Birth are early samples, offers us a window into the complexities of early 20th century China and leads us to a new assessment of Christian influence in China during this tumultuous period. First, I want to review the Young's argument. Young argues that Christianity exerted a far-reaching influence on the intellect and the creativity of May 4th writers. And not only Christian writers, but both baptized believers and secular non-believers. That's what got me interested in Ba Jin's Christian themes in his literary works. He argues that this influence came through mission schools. We knew that there was a big increase in the number of mission schools, the influence of the missionary movement, what was taught in those schools. He said this influence is exhibited in the fact that there was a new humanitarian focus in these writers, creators of modern Chinese literature. There was a focus on the ordinary people and their struggles as opposed to heroes. Even their narrative frameworks and the characters they created were inspired by biblical narratives. There was a new focus on the protagonist and the protagonist's internal predicament, focusing on the internal world of the characters, as opposed to the traditional focus on the complex external relationships of the characters. And in terms of the themes found in these works, there were recurrent themes of sin and repentance, suffering and redemption, a savior figure, and suffering and conversion. Now, I thought I would test it out on one of the authors. Ba Jin, however, never attended a mission school. And in his own writings, autobiographies, as well as his biographies of him, anarchism completely overshadows Christianity as the predominant source of influence in these biographical and autobiographical accounts. Yet, the presence of biblical imagery and Christian concepts is salient. Therefore, I believe that a more nuanced analysis is needed. So the first novel I would like to discuss is Perdition. I'll give us a brief synopsis and tease out some of the themes in this work. Written in 1928, when Ba Jin was studying in France, Perdition tells the story of a young labor organizer and poet named Du Daxin. He befriends two university students, a brother and a sister from a well-to-do family, Li Leng and Li Jingshu, whose father is a former scholar official under the Qing dynasty. Du, filled with anger and despair against the injustices of Chinese society and suffering of the working poor, falls in love with Miss Li. In the meantime, he befriends and mentors a young factory worker, Zhang Weiqun, in their work as labor organizers. One day, after work, Zhang is arrested. With a stack of revolutionary flyers, he was cruelly tortured for a week and then publicly executed in a gruesome beheading. In grief and anguish, Du bids farewell with Miss Li. Then he disguises as a journalist and attempts to assassinate the warlord whose henchmen carried out the arrest, torture, and execution of Zhang. The warlord survives the amateur assassination attempt, and the novel concludes with the arrest and execution of Du. Youthful romance and revolution are recurrent themes in Ba Jin's fictional works. By the time he started writing Perdition in 1927 at the age of 23, Ba Jin had identified himself as an anarchist for 5 years. In January of that year, he arrived in Paris from Shanghai and began a nearly 2-year sojourn in France. He wrote Perdition, his first novel, during this period. And after he returned to China at the end of 1928, the novel appeared in serial form in the first months of 1929. Like other May 4th authors, he rejected the traditional gentry society and its hierarchical values and the Confucian ideological underpinnings. Yes, as Young observes in the influence of Christian culture on the new literature of May 4th, Ba Jin's works are also permeated with a humanitarian concern for the masses who eke out a precarious existence at the bottom of an unjust society. They exhibit a longing for both a China liberated from the yoke imposed by imperialist nations and a just and compassionate society. Strikingly, in this work, written by a self-identified anarchist in the late 1920s, after several waves of nationwide anti-Christian agitation, the vision for a good society is not only informed by Christian ethos, but also unambiguously expressed through Christian vocabulary and biblical imagery. In chapter 10 of Perdition, titled Love and Hatred, Du and the Li siblings have a lengthy discussion on the relative merits of viewing the world through the lenses of love and hatred. Li Leng says to Du, quote, "I think your problem lies in the fact that you have abandoned love. You see only from the perspective of hatred. Therefore, you think everything in the world is hateful and sad. If our world is as bad as you say it is precisely because people have abandoned love and they hate each other. It is because there is too little love and too much hatred. Therefore, we should vanquish hatred with love." Du responds, to the Li siblings by recounting the many tragedies he has either experienced or witnessed in his life. This discussion among the three friends ends with Du's sad words, quote, "Even though love is still burning in my heart and I still want to love and I'm still willing to love, but I can't. At least I can't love anyone. And I can't tell people to love one another in this world where people rob people, people oppress people, people devour people, people ride roughshod over people, people batter people, people murder people. All who have built their happiness on the suffering of others should perish. I swear with all my heart, those people should perish. Not until after they have perished is it possible for people to love each other and be worthy to speak of love. Not now. Christians say that Jesus was crucified for his advocacy of love and forgiveness. No, I want to tell those who are being devoured and who are about to be devoured not to be like lambs being delivered to the mouths of enemies. Even if they die, they must die fighting like wolves, not without taking a few bites of their enemies." Unquote. This anguished exchange between the three characters reveals Ba Jin's familiarity with the Christian gospel in a nutshell, namely the crucifixion of Jesus, and with the idea that somehow this is linked to love and forgiveness. The opposition between love as advocated by the well-to-do Li siblings and the hatred and striking back at the oppressors, as Du calls for with great earnestness, is a theme that guides the development of the plot and the characters in it. It is symbolic of the struggle in young Ba Jin's heart in the face of the pervasive unjust suffering that he observed around him in early 20th century Chinese society. This struggle between the gospel of love and violent action in search of justice is brought to a head when Zhang, the person that Du has been mentoring, is arrested, brutally tortured, and publicly executed in a badly carried out beheading. In shock and grief, Du seems to hear the headless corpse ask, "When will the revolution come?" Du remembers with pain and shame the picture of a hopeful future that he used to paint for Zhang as they went about their work of labor organization. Quote, "In the very near future, the great day will come. At that time, there will be no more weeping, no more suffering. Every family will have a dwelling place, every mouth plenty to eat, and everyone clothing. People will live tranquilly and peacefully. All the traitors who have ever caused harm, are causing harm, or will cause harm, will perish. Yet, this moment before this person, all his words are powerless. Perish, perish. The ones who perish are not the traitors, but this person who believes that the person who perished once had a heart like gold that detested evil, loved justice, and sought the welfare of others." Unquote. Fantasies of revenge, the torment of guilt, and his romantic longings for Miss Li compel Du to visit the young woman one night, confess his love to her, and confide in her his plan to avenge Zhang. After the teary farewell, the battle between the path of death through violent action and sharing a peaceful future with Miss Li by spreading the gospel of love continues to rage in Du's mind throughout the night. Quote, "In his mind appeared a tableau for the future, the two of them living together in the working class districts of cities or in quiet scenic villages, educating workers, peasants, and their children, working for their advancement, and spreading among them the free and egalitarian gospel of love." Unquote. Twice he returns to the Li siblings' residence without entering. Finally, he makes his choice with a sense of fatalism. quote, he understood suddenly. He was a man sentenced by fate. He had no part in human happiness. All the doors to happiness were closed before him. She should not change his fate for the better or enable him to enjoy again the pleasures of life, not even with her pure and great love. Death is bound to come. Rather than being led peacefully to slaughter like gentle lambs, it is better to be the first one to strike, to be an avenger for the many who suffer. Unquote. This internal struggle, taking place in the novel's protagonist between the attraction of the gospel of love and the compulsion to violent action, is emblematic of the ideologies that were vying for the hearts and minds of educated Chinese youths in the early 20th century. Ba Jin espoused anarchism, and most in the May 4th generation espoused communism. In short, Christianity and the love it preaches lost the battle for hearts and minds among educated youths in Republican China. Hence, the extensive use of Christian concepts and biblical imagery in Ba Jin's early works is puzzling. The next author, the next work, the same author, Ba Jin, the next work I would like to talk about is New Birth. The usage of Christian concepts and biblical imagery continues and is even more pronounced in New Birth, the sequel to Perdition. Ba Jin wrote New Birth in 1931, after he had returned from France and settled in Shanghai. The first draft of New Birth was destroyed, unfortunately, in the Japanese bombing of Shanghai's poor Chinese residential district, Zhabei, in January 1932. The bombing was Japanese retaliation to clashes between Chinese soldiers and Japanese Marines in Shanghai on the night of January 28th of 1932, following several months of anti-Japanese boycotts in the city. The boycotts were in turn a response to Japanese aggression in the Mukden incident of September 1931, a precursor to Japan's annexation of Manchuria. Ba Jin rewrote the novel in the summer of 1932 in steaming, stifling heat of Shanghai, as he called it, a memorial that cannot be destroyed by the bombs of imperialism. New Birth tells of the conversion of Li Long following Du Daxing's death, from listlessness to revolutionary commitment. Structured as a series of Li Long's diary entries, the novel opens with Li Long mulling over his sister, Miss Li's transformation into a committed labor organizer. Repeatedly, Ba Jin, through the protagonist, refers to Miss Li's revolutionary commitment as her newfound faith, or Xingyang. Li Long muses to himself, quote, "Sister seems very happy because she has faith. As for me, I have nothing now," unquote. Most of the plot is driven by the efforts of Miss Li and a fellow female labor organizer, Miss Tseng, a mutual friend of the Li siblings and Li Long's love interest, to persuade Li Long to join the revolutionary cause. In a note to Li Long, Miss Tseng refers to herself as a door of salvation, in words reminiscent of the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John. Quote, "It is Miss Zhang's beautiful handwriting, but there were only the following words: 'I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved,'" unquote. In response, Li Long writes a letter to the two young women in which he expresses his resistance to the latter's revolutionary cause. Quote, "No matter what, I cannot believe in the stupid, ignorant masses as God. I deny all, I resist all, even the people whom you believe to be sacred, I oppose," unquote. Zhang's striking assertion to be The door of salvation is reiterated by Li Neng's sister in yet another letter. Here, these young people are writing letters back and forth. Quote, older brother, Miss Zhang and I can save you. What she said is right. She is the door. You must enter by her to be saved, unquote. Ba Jin takes even greater creative liberties with Jesus' words when he has Li Neng reply to his sister, again in the letter, with another saying of Jesus. Li Neng says, I cannot come now. I do not intend to come. Now I will still say to people as Jesus did, if you do not repent, you will all perish likewise, unquote. In a subsequent visit by the two young women, Li Neng wrestles with the latter's evangelistic zeal. He says to himself, he writes in his diary, young sister walked over to us and says with her bright voice, Miss Zhang, I commit my older brother to you. I know your love will save him. Older brother, trust Miss Zhang, follow her. Let the three of us go create our own life together, unquote. She says so much, just like a preacher who is evangelizing, but her voice was sincere. It was trembling because of love. This was one of the entries, diary entries of Li Neng. It is striking that Ba Jin uses Christian concepts and terminology to depict revolutionary commitment and zeal. And he turns the revolutionary cause into the new gospel of hope, salvation, and new life. When Li Neng is finally aboard a ship taking him to Shanghai, to the southern city of Xiamen, when he's decided to devote himself to the revolutionary cause, he decides to go to Xiamen. He discovers a new life that is birthed within him. Quote, a new sensation appeared within my body and a new illusion caught my eyes. To me, life presented a new face again, and I became another person, a new person. On the road to perdition, I had a new birth, unquote. New birth concludes with Li Neng's imprisonment and his reflections while awaiting his execution for having been the chief organizer of a workers' strike. Quote, and these are his reflections before his execution. I must finish taking the last step with courage, for my road is no longer the road of perdition. I am using my death to prosper humankind. Thus, as humankind walks towards the road of eternal prosperity and happiness, my life too will not be extinguished. There is only the continuation of humankind and no individual perdition. Death is a crown of thorns. Let me put on this crown of thorns with my head held up high and walk up to the cross of sacrifice. Perhaps tonight my blood will be spilled on mountain rocks, my body buried in the soil, my name forgotten, but I will surely not perish. My death will in turn bring me new birth. I will find my new birth in the upward prosperity of humankind, unquote. The novel, sad as it is, literally ends with a quotation from the Gospel of John with chapter and verse and no commentary from Ba Jin himself. Quote, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. John chapter 12, verse 24, unquote. The extensive use of Christian concepts and biblical imagery in the works of an avowed anarchist poses some perplexing questions. What was the appeal of Christianity for Ba Jin? Even as he espoused anarchist revolution, was not Ba Jin cognizant of the anarchist opposition to Christianity? What clues does this apparent ideological conflation provide for understanding the author and his times and the legacy of the missionary movement in China? In an essay titled God or Labor, the Two Camps, and an essay from 1873, the father of anarchism, Mikhail Bakunin, proudly declared, quote, atheism is truth, or rather the real basis of all truths. And Bakunin sets forth several propositions against the creed of the theologians, the last of which was that the routing of God will be a necessary consequence of the triumph of mankind. Ba Jin, who translated many anarchist works, among them those of Bakunin, must have known of the anarchist distaste for Christianity. Yet, as seen in the two novels examined in this talk, the Christian concepts of salvific love, new birth by way of suffering and death, and eternal life appealed to Ba Jin strongly, powerfully. Below are a few preliminary thoughts. Ba Jin's works reveal the eclectic influences at work in the May 4th movement. This confluence of literary, political, and philosophical influences can be seen in the prominent place love has in Ba Jin's works. Ba Jin credits his loving mother as the person who taught him to love, even to love all people. However, the use of the term love in the context of early Republican China and the traditional gentry family reflects the rapidly changing cultural vocabulary and literary idioms of the May 4th era. Traditionally, the term 慈 is used to refer to a parent's love for his or her child, and the term 仁 is used to refer to the sentiment or attitude that the good or upright man should have towards his fellow men. The fact that Ba Jin, who embarked on his writing career in the exhilarating years of the May 4th movement, used I, love, to express the highest ideal in human relations and in man's relationship to the world, shows the widespread influence of Christianity and of Western literature more broadly in early 20th century China. In New Birth, maternal love, romantic love, and love for humanity are often conflated, especially in the sentiments of the ardor of the young protagonists. Miss Li writes to her mother, quote, mother's love should not be an individual's possession. This kind of love should spread broadly. Mother's love should give its warmth abroad like the sun's rays, so as to leave no one in the world abandoned by love. I'm loving humanity with your love, so that the many in the world who have no taste of love all their lives can also bask in love's rays, so that many, many dark and melancholic faces can light up in laughter because of love. The masses who are surrounded by poverty, oppression, darkness, and humiliation, their sad and inhuman lives, their simple faith, their upright heart, are worthy of sympathy. For their sake, even if I sacrifice my love, even if you lose your daughter, mother, I think it would be as it should be, unquote. Here, the author elevates maternal love to the level of love for humanity from the perspective of a young revolutionary. Subsequently, in the plot, when Li Long first expresses his love for Miss Zhang, and the two young people have their first kiss, the thought that crosses the young man's mind is that of his mother's embrace. Quote, she strokes my hair with one hand. Her hand is surprisingly gentle. I felt as if I had returned to childhood. Mother was comforting me and stroking my hair with her hand. That hand and that soft bosom were my harbor from storms in my childhood. Now, I found a new harbor in this hand, and on this soft bosom. My lips pressed hard on her lips. The long, ardent kiss joined us together, unquote. Here, the romantic love between Li Long and Miss Zhang and the love that the male protagonist once received from his mother are merged. The interweaving themes of maternal love, romantic love, and lofty humanitarian love were recurrent cries of the author's heart. Ba Jin clearly sided with anarchist direct action as the means to creating a just world where prosperity is shared by all. In Perdition, Du Daxin's wavering between carrying out his assassination plan and sharing a beautiful future with Miss Li is almost a debate between socialist revolution and the Christian social gospel. This longing for a world where injustices no longer exist is hauntingly expressed in Perdition by Zhang Weiqin's question, when will the revolution come? Yet Du's vision for such a world to be ushered in by revolution bears as much resemblance to passages in the book of Isaiah and the book of Revelation in the Bible as it does the anarchist utopia. The revolutionary protagonist looks forward to a future when, quote, there will be no more weeping, no more suffering. Every family will have a dwelling place, every mouth plenty to eat, and everyone clothing. People will live tranquilly and peacefully. All the traitors who have caused harm, are causing harm, or will cause harm will perish, unquote. In Revelation, we read, for behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. These biblical images of a world that God promises his people were perhaps a source of inspiration for Ba Jin, providing him with a vocabulary to articulate his longings for a just and loving world. On one level, they came from a religion that was attacked by the political ideology he espoused. On the other level, the anarchist vision of human flourishing is perhaps not so different from the Christian vision. There is much to critique in Ba Jin's superficial understanding of major Christian concepts. However, I want to suggest that what Christianity and anarchism have in common is their critique of the world as it is, especially where human dignity and the worth of each individual, even that of the lowest in society, are concerned. To use a biblical term, both rebuke injustice with their prophetic voices. Ultimately, what is expressed in Ba Jin's writings is a heart crying out for justice, love, and goodness. From the First Opium War to the 1930s, almost a century of missionary endeavors had made the presence of Christian institutions highly and widely visible, and Christian ideas familiar to educated Chinese. However, as shown in Ba Jin's case, how these ideas are received and understood may not be as intended by the missionaries who carried the gospel to China. The jury is still out on the gospel's influence and impact on modern China. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Oh my gosh, that was fascinating. How you brought all of these seemingly disparate things together and made these amazing connections. We already have a couple of questions in the chat, so I am going to go ahead and start reading those questions for you. And so this is from Wayne Tan. Thank you for this fascinating talk. This question is about Ba Jin and his anarchist views. By the turn of the 20th century, Russian literature was a major source for Chinese writers on Christianity, revolution, and anarchy. Could you say more about the relationship between Ba Jin and Russian literature, e.g. how Ba Jin understood Leo Tolstoy, whose late works on his life and Christianity took a turn toward anarchism?
Okay, that's a very good question. It's right on. Thank you, Wayne. Yes, Ba Jin, actually, in this novel, Ba Jin refers to the Russian revolutionary tradition. He actually goes back to the 1600s, the 1700s, various peasant revolutions against Tsarist Russia. So he draws inspiration from Russia, and not in this one, but in the novel A Family, Jia, he quotes from Turgenev. I think I'm not all that familiar with Russian literature, but he does quote from Russian literature, but his influence is quite wide. He also quotes from Feuerbach, which whether it's Russian and or French or even German, but certainly the Russian revolutionary tradition features prominently in Perdition. Thank you.
Great. Well, he has a part 2 here. So this is the second part of his question. What is the symmetry between anarchism and Christianity for Ba Jin? Did Ba Jin see anarchy, as a means to end the old world, a world that has to descend into chaos to be reborn in hope?
Mm-hmm. Actually, the similarities or parallels between anarchism and Christianity is my way of trying to make sense why he would use so many, why he uses all these biblical imagery and concepts in his work, but politically, he's a self-proclaimed anarchist. And that actually makes him rather lonely in the May 4th movement, because during the May 4th movement, many of his contemporaries espoused communism, and anarchism was more and more a lost cause. But I'm still trying to flesh this out for myself as well, kind of wrestling with it. My sense is that perhaps it's simply an inarticulate anarchism expressed more than the ideology. Certainly, he argued for revolution, but it was simply, a cry for a better world, and it could be anarchism or it could be something else, right? That ultimately, what inspired him in the Christian imagery is that vision of a better world. And in anarchism, there's also a vision of a better world. Emma Goldman was one whom Ba Jin corresponded with. And Emma Goldman has an essay where she says, well, the future of work should be such so that even the factory worker, the work for the factory worker should be like the work for a scientist. It should be as inspiring, and it should be about learning and not drudgery, right? So there is that, in both, there is that longing for human flourishing.
Great. All right. Lauren asked the question, what inspired you to embark on this study?
Sometimes I go on rabbit trails. This was a rabbit trail. No, but as up until about a year ago, I was focusing on Chinese Christian publications, and because early 20th century, we see the rise of commercial publishing in China, and it was kind of it was a renaissance. And I had come across the argument that not only the flourishing of modern Chinese literatures through the May 4th movement. The Christian publishing was the other unacknowledged May 4th. So I was kind of thinking of Christian writings on the one hand and May 4th writings on the other hand. But when I came across Young's book about Christian influence on May 4th writers, I thought, well, this is interesting. That makes the two, rather than thinking of them as two separate camps, and the two are actually intertwined. And my project for many years has, my desire is to write the history of the Chinese church into the history of modern China, and to write the history of modern China into the history of Christianity in China. Because thus far, I think in the historical literature, the history of Christianity in China almost exists in a vacuum. And the history of modern Chinese history, the history of modern China overlooks the influence of Christianity on modern China. So this was a rabbit trail that grew out of it. And thank you, Lauren.
Great. So the next question from Jean, as a historian, how have you found using novels as historical sources? What challenges do you find using them, and in what ways do you think they provide useful historical insights?
Mm-hmm. I have used Ba Jin for my modern history, history of modern China repeatedly, simply, and I just opened the talk with the fact that Ba Jin won this literary prize in 1990, but personally, I think his literature is okay as a novelist. So I feel embarrassed saying this, but I do appreciate his work mainly for his reflections of the era. The fact that he was a May 4th writer, and his work was popular, not elitist. He was highly popular. The romanticism is a bit too much for me. But he describes the gentry family. He really expressed the sentiments of the young people who rebelled against Confucian, the Confucian underpinnings of the gentry family. So in many ways, I find him to be a very rich source. But certainly, literature is literature, right? Historian want something more solid. And I didn't include in this presentation, but in this paper, I actually trace the sources of Christian influence for him, even though he never went to a mission school. And what I found was that his mother knew some missionary ladies.
Wow, fascinating. Well, and again, you're a historian, not a literary critic, so that kind of makes sense, but defining it as an important source as well. And actually, you answered a question I was going to ask, is if Ba Jin was popular, his writings were popular at the time that he was writing them, or is he one of those odder artists that kind of gets discovered later? But you've answered that question, that he was incredibly popular at the time.
Yeah, he was very popular. He had a fan base. People wrote to him.
That's fabulous. Interesting. Okay. Next question from Janice. Was the way Ba Jin wrote about love different than the way Chinese writers before the 20th century wrote about love?
Yes, a lot more romantic in the Western sense. So, I want to argue that he was more influenced by, I assume you mean romantic love, right? So this part about, a kiss, the bosom, the soft hands, the soft bosom of this young girl, and my lips pressing on her tightly, or something like that. That's a lot more explicit than traditional literature. In traditional literature, there is romance, but usually it's through the glance, and you don't see them like hugging. Yeah, but there is a romance in traditional literature, and certainly in traditional literature there is explicit and almost pornographic novels. There's a well-known pornographic novel as well. But when it comes to kind of pure romance, it's not. Sometimes, for students, if I assign something like that, it's hard for them to tell that they're romantically in love with each other.
Great, thank you. So there's a comment actually from Wayne. He's commenting to the answer to one of his questions. Yes, Turgenev, fathers and sons, I believe. So I think he's referring to or piece of writing. So just wanted to mention that to you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
And then from Judy, New Testament Greek has 3 words for kinds of love: philios for family love, eros for romantic love, and agave. Agape. For self-giving love. Do the Chinese have several words for love? If so, what are they and their meanings? I found Ba Jin's transition from erotic affection from a woman as reminding him of his mother's expressions of motherly affections, and commenting that was kind of what's sparking this question. So
yeah, in the Bible, only the word I is used. So there's no, so basically, if we want the equivalent of love, we have to use I. But in traditional Chinese writings, as I mentioned, usually parental love, the word 慈, kindness or compassion is used. And in kind of the generous humanitarian sentiment of a gentleman or a good man towards his fellow man, that it should be 仁, right? So that's also compassion or kindness. And so this idea of universal love is definitely Christian.
Okay. And then there's another comment from Janice, going back to the idea of the kinds of love. She was, asking about any kind of love really in Chinese literature prior to the 20th century. Love is the most important thing, or love that redeems.
Mm-hmm.
So
and the idea of love, redemptive power of love, that's definitely Christian.
Okay. For our audience, are there any other final questions for Gloria on this incredibly interesting and just so deep, just such a deep topic? We could obviously go on and on, but if anyone had any other questions. Oh, yes, hold on. From Wayne. Thinking about literary context from a historical angle, and this might sound like a hypothetical question, what was Ba Jin responding to, e.g. the response to other Chinese works? And did Ba Jin see his works in conversation with other Chinese writers?
From what I was able to find out through through his biographies and his personal reminiscences, he seemed to be doing pretty much his own thing. He had friends, he had fans, and he had people who critiqued him. But he didn't seem to emulate people like Lu Xun or kind of the more elite writers. he tends to take writing very personally. One of his personal autobiographical accounts is "Giving My Heart to the Reader," and he focuses a lot on his own the influences on his life, his growing experiences, and how writing for him is almost like a catharsis. Yeah, so I don't, but don't quote me on that. I may read something else and find out that I'm wrong.
Oh, he says thank you.
Thanks for asking the question.
All right, any other final questions? Give a second here for somebody to write something in if they have any other final questions. Okay, otherwise I think we will draw our evening to a close, and thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you, Gloria, for an incredibly interesting talk and on a subject that provided such an interesting contextual context to our exhibit at the museum on missionaries and the influence of missionary work. And we just appreciate your time and your expertise so much. And thank you all. And thank you again for Gloria for being here. And we hope to see you at the museum, and everyone have a great evening. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for sharing the evening.